Institute that has been critical of some of the present environmental strategies and environmentalism as it is currently practiced, and they have offered some alternative and often controversial alternatives. First, we're going to hear from Steve Chazen. Steve Chazen received a Bachelor of Science degree in geology from Rutgers University, a master's degree in finance from the University of Houston, and a PhD in geology from Michigan State University. He worked as a managing director in corporate finance and mergers and acquisitions at Merrill Lynch, and after a very successful career in that field, in 1994 he started working for Occidental Petroleum, a publicly traded oil company, fourth largest in the nation, that until very recently was headquartered in Los Angeles. He was the executive vice president, and he became the president and the chief financial officer in December of 2007. So he's the chief executive officer since 2011. He was president since 2007. Very successful guy. According to a study by the Grazadillo School of Business and Management at Pepperdine, under his leadership, he earned the title as being the most valued business leader in all of Southern California. He serves on the board of directors of the American Petroleum Institute, and he has served on the boards of the Lyondell Chemical Company, the Premcor, and Washington Mutual. And I like to think that his career reached its zenith when he joined the board of directors of the Aquarium of the Pacific. Right, Steve? He also is a member of the board of trustees of the Catalina Island Conservancy. I can say that in my 12 years as the president here, we've never had a more dedicated, generous board member, and never once, not once, has he tried to influence anything that I have said, any programs that we have done. So it's a real pleasure in inviting Steve, and he came all the way from Texas just to be with all of you. Steve Chazen.
Thank you, Jerry. That's the shortest talk I've ever heard Jerry make. Yeah. But he definitely will tell you how to make the watch. So I'd like to sort of talk about what I know something about, which I'm somewhat different than some. I've always felt that everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but not their own facts. And I'm not an expert in public policy. If you want to talk about public policy, you should exclude me from that discussion. Lots of people who are experts in public policy, and I don't know any more than the guy taking quarters in front of the Starbucks knows. I'm also not an atmospheric physicist. I don't know anything about that at all either. About all I know is how to get oil and gas out of the ground in an efficient manner. And so that's really what I'd like to talk about today. Except maybe at the end, I'll try to keep the things that are factual and maybe a little opinion at the end. This is sort of what I want to talk about. I want to talk about the U.S. gas industry. I want to talk about the U.S. oil industry. I want to talk about some market issues in the United States. Everybody wants to talk about fracking, whether they know anything about it or not. I'd like to talk about some mythology that goes with it. And finally, I'd like to talk about some economic facts about the oil and gas business. I separated gas from oil because they're different. Gas is a local commodity. It's basically restricted to where it's produced. There's a little bit of LNG in the world, but it's real minor. So natural gas for Americans is about natural gas produced in this country. There's very little that enters the border and very little that is exported. And even if you went through the most extreme export, most of the gas would be consumed in the United States. Oil, on the other hand, is a world commodity. It's fungible, oil here, oil there, you can't tell the difference. So that's really, so gas is, you need to talk about gas in a different way than you talk about oil. This is U.S. gas, and this is the federal government's projection. They have an unbroken record of failure in this. Only one that's worse is the International Energy Administration, which hires former librarians, I think. But they're not really very good at this, and they make some odd assumptions. This is what the government thinks. So back in 2010, it's about 20 trillion cubic feet of gas a day. Out here, you're talking about 33, 34 trillion cubic feet of gas a day. A fairly large increase. Don't get confused by the trillions. Just a fairly large increase. Very little, as you can see, for LNG, the little blue lines. Very little for LNG growth. It takes 5 years from the time you start to build an LNG, when you have your permits, to actually turn your first LNG out of the country. So, it's like population. If the plant hasn't started today, there won't be any gas till 2020. So, very little LNG. This is, I think, a conservative number. The United States could produce a lot more than this, and we'll talk about that later. This is sort of writing it out. We consume it all basically in the United States. Very little imports. We consume it all. If we could consume more, we could produce more. This goes back to 1900. In the 1940s, they built the interstate pipeline system to move gas from Texas and Louisiana into the north to heat people's houses. And so that's what this change here is. All the gas before that came out of oil wells and produced a little bit of gas with it. The oil was generally burned locally. And so when they built the interstate, when they built the pipeline systems, take gas really to northeast or through the mid-continent, this is when the gas production picked up. So the production was always sort of there. It just, there wasn't any reason to do it. When I started in this business, somewhere in here, gas was 5 cents an MCF, a nickel. It was a byproduct. It's around $4 and change today. If you do the arithmetic, you did better in passbook savings accounts. And you can see here the pickup here in gas production at the tail. So gas has always been a byproduct, not sought really, and sort of something that came with the oil. You had to do something with it. This is where it's produced. Some here in California, some down here in South Texas, a whole bunch of it over here in the east. The east has produced gas probably since 1920 in fair amounts, and very shallow gas wells. The gas wells, as I recall, had little plastic pipes, and the people in Appalachia would puncture the gas and take it and put it in their houses to heat their houses and cook. And then every so often there would be an accident, and they would blow up their house. And they always complained that the gas didn't smell, but of course the gas doesn't have any aroma unless you add something with it to make it smell. But this gas here has been in production almost 100 years. There's more of it now. It's done a different way, and there's more in the United States. Estimates people have are way low. So you could produce gas in California. If we got at it, we could produce all the gas that was needed in the state, within the state. Texas has always been an exporter of gas. When I started, I remember the head of the Texas Railroad Commission didn't have anything to do with railroads anymore. It regulated the energy business. gas sold within the state of Texas for about $1 an MCF and was sold interstate for somewhere around a nickel or a dime. And he always claimed the Yankees were stealing the gas, and this was this was a plot by the New York bankers to bankrupt the state. But Louisiana, a major producer, but if you look at it, there's gas everywhere. The United States could fund essentially its entire stationary power needs, that is, stationary power plants with natural gas, if we got at it. Where's it go? This is today. It's probably accurate. Maybe they're better at history than the future. But electric power generation, industrial. It used to be residential was a bigger share of the pie years ago. Commercial or Burger Kings, and then a little bit in the fuel and some plant consumption. This, as it replaces coal, is growing. And as chemical plants get built in the United States, I never thought I'd see another chemical plant built in this country. And there's scores of them on the drawing boards now. They're all fired by natural gas. So this pie will grow. This pie could be a lot bigger. And the residential use would be a lot less. Years ago, gas and fuel oil were viewed as competing. So they sold, except for transportation differences, the same price per BTU. So, but everybody who has been able to switch from fuel oil has in this country. Still a lot of fuel oil burned in the Middle East and in China. Burning fuel oil is for heating and electricity is generally pretty wasteful. Oil is really different. It's different for a lot of reasons, but from a physical perspective, it's more difficult. Oil has large molecules and gas has small molecules. And so when you try to produce oil, it doesn't flow as well, and it's simply more difficult to produce. There's also different places you can produce gas. Gas can be created over a wide range of physical environments. Oil is fairly narrow in its physical environment, so there's a lot less oil available in the world and in the United States now. I always found this interesting. Maybe I'm the only one. Here's the U.S. production. I think everybody's heard about this growth of the U.S. production. This is the government again. They're predicting that in 2016 and 17, the U.S. growth of oil production will stop. And we'll talk about why they would think that. The world, this is the rest of the world. This is the whole world. So this is the non-U.S. production. It's really done nothing. So all of the growth in oil production since 2010 has pretty much come out of the United States. So the rest of the world, not much. And you can see very small changes. And as they look out in the future, they're not expecting it. I think people sometimes forget that oil is like a soda pop bottle. And you shake up the soda pop bottle and you pop the cork and the fizz comes out. And eventually the fizz goes away. And that's what happens with oil, an oil reservoir. You put the well in, you get a lot of energy, it comes out real quick, and it slows up. And so we have fields that were found in the 1920s, still producing, but they produce a lot of water and less oil, and they deplete. So every year there's a little less produced. World oil consumption, they're predicting no growth, which is, I don't know if that's caused by an economic view or it's caused by the fact that there just isn't really enough oil to fund much growth. Oil and GDP, world GDP, have always been closely tied. World economy gets good, more oil is used. Looking just at the U.S., people think we're going to be energy independent. I hear people talk about it all the time. We're not car independent, but somehow we need to be energy independent. it's not a mathematical possibility. It's about, here at the peak, we're sort of 50-50 of imports and U.S. production. Using their numbers, you basically go back to 60-40 or so. To get to these numbers is almost physically impossible. You could never get to this 15 million or whatever. Nor should you, by the way. But because the rest of the world, the developing world, will want oil. And we probably shouldn't be using this much. But the facts are it is mathematically impossible to be independent of oil. A lot of that oil comes from Canada. Some comes from Mexico, although that's declining rapidly. Some comes from Venezuela. But that doesn't have to come from Saudi Arabia. You can see here as they look ahead even further, the imports rise again because the U.S. production, for reasons we're going to see here in a little bit, almost surely will decline as it goes out. Again, going back to the Rockefeller Trust, you can see the production of crude building up. This is 2.5 million barrels a day, hitting 10 million barrels a day. 2010, we started to turn up a little bit, and people think we're going to get back to this 10 million, and we might, but probably not much more than that. There are other liquids people talk about. There's biofuels. Again, these are all government statistics. And then there's natural gas plant liquids. Natural gas plant liquids are not the equivalent of oil. They're more like the equivalent of natural gas. We used to sell them as natural gas. And so they're a small blending compound. The rest of it's used as feedstock for chemical plants. Most of it needs to be exported. There isn't enough demand in the U.S. for it. People talk about liquids. A lot of times they talk about these combined numbers. This one, the brown thing, is misleading. It's not a substitute for crude. I use the same slide again. Oil production, major producer of oil growth in the country is here in West Texas and in North Dakota. The growth in the last few years has been really in those two places. Down here, people talk about this play here. This is really a natural gas liquids play, and California is still in its early stages. We'll talk about some market issues, transportation, local control, and exports. This is probably one of the more irritating things for me. The price of natural gas in Japan is around $16. In Europe, we're paying the Russians around $10, $11. The U.S. is about $4 at the wellhead. Everybody thinks that if we export gas, that our numbers will look like this. Okay? And I hear people say, people with, supposedly college education, but I think they failed the math course. This is what it costs to transport natural gas to either Europe or Japan. Japan's further. So you have to take the gas, put it in a facility, you liquefy it, which takes energy. You put it in a ship, which looks like a thermos jug, large thermos jug, and you ship it away. These ships are large and expensive. There's never been an accident for them, but it's not the most thoughtful thing in the world necessarily. But the United States, even if you got equilibrium in the world, that is to say, these were somehow got to these prices. The United States would always have a $5 or $6 an MCF advantage because we don't have to transport it. There's no real, if you look people talk about natural gas, in China and other places. It hasn't worked. We've been through, in my life, we've been through 7 Polish gas bonanzas, none of which have worked. See, the Poles, like lots of people, I see it in the Middle East all the time, they believe that God wouldn't have been so cruel as to give the Russians all the gas and the Poles none. So they believe that the Poland must have a lot of gas. The Yemenis believe that God wouldn't have been so cruel as to give those worthless Saudis a bunch of oil, and their border is right up against Saudi Arabia, so there must be oil right against the border. Well, it's not true. And so there's all this hope that the country's going to find this stuff. We've been after this stuff a long time. So basically, the United States will always have an industrial advantage of at least this amount over any place else in the world. So, if people would allow industry to build gas-fired businesses in the United States, no matter what happens, even with a robust export of gas, you'll always have this huge advantage over some other place. If we got at it, moving from the facts, the opinion here for a minute, if you got at it, you could rebuild the American middle class on the sea of gas, because these are industrial jobs. These are so-called blue-collar jobs that are created by this. This isn't created by, this isn't jobs for Harvard MBAs.
What's the mix of the price advantage? Distribution networks that already exist, or just there's an awful lot of gas here?
There's an awful lot of gas here. There's no gas in Japan at all. All our gas is imported, so they have all transportation costs. Europe has very little gas. They try. The gas that they get is from Russia, and the Russians extort them. So the contracts are tied to fuel oil equivalents. So if fuel oil is selling for $70 a barrel, it's $10 an MCF. It's 7 to 1. So that's how the contracts are set. The United States could export gas and build a middle class again, or a blue-collar class. I think this is sort of an opportunity. The other opportunity exists here. Energy in Germany especially is a monopoly that the Russians have. While you can't do anything about it right away, unless you believe that Germany should shift more to Russians, I think we have part of the solution by shipping them gas that we have. A lot of protectionists in this country who don't want to do this, but thought I'd talk about this since everybody wants to talk about it. It's called fracking. The good folks in the Beverly Hills City Council have abolished fracking within the borders of Beverly Hills. There's a small oil field behind Beverly Hills High School. But I don't think anybody's ever proposed it's sort of a free thing. I'm going to show this slide twice. All oil wells look like this at the top. Doesn't make a difference whether you're going to frack it or not frack it or whatever. This section here, here's your soil, and here's if there's an aquifer, here's the aquifer. These are all casings and cemented here. You use X-rays effectively to make sure it's tight. Doesn't make any difference whether the well's fracked or didn't frack. That's how you keep whatever is produced here from going in. And then you go down here deeper. This example is 6,000 feet. In a fracked well, you typically come down. You turn the drill this way, and then you basically set off explosions to push out to break up this hard rock here and have it produce oil. But this whole area here, every well in the United States that's drilled today has something that looks exactly like this, whether it's fracked or it isn't fracked. So if you're worried about aquifers, you worry about all oil wells, not just fracked ones. There's nothing special about fracked wells in that regard. this is the source of the government's view that, that this production will peak at some point in the not too distant future. This is what a typical well looks like that's been fracked. So you start out with 7 million cubic feet of gas a day. A year later, you're down nearly 70%. And a year after that, you're down 50% from that. So these wells, in a very short period of time, are producing not much. So what you do is you get all your stuff up front. A well in this formation, which is one of the more prolific ones, runs about $8 million. You get your money back fairly quickly, but the production falls very sharply. So as you produce more and more every year, you drill more and more wells, this decline curve becomes increasingly expensive. You've got to drill more and more wells to keep this decline from getting to you. So that's the basis for the view, which I think is correct, that you got to drill a lot of wells, and eventually, because of this very sharp decline, there's nothing you can really do about it. You think about what you do when you frack a well. You have a formation which is akin to cement. You're putting something in it to break it up. The gas flows into the broken up stuff. It immediately comes out from what you broke up, and then it flows slowly into the broken up area. And so what happens is you wind up with these declines. These are real numbers. These aren't theoretical numbers. This is actually the real numbers.
You can make 10 times the cost of drilling a well?
Well, the well costs get about $4 an MCF. And so you wind up, well, no, you got to look at the decline. So you get your money back in about a year and a half, 2 years. But within 2 years, you basically, so it's 68, you got 80% of what it's going to produce down at the end of the second year. And then it just runs for a real long period of time. Yeah?
Do you have to build special wells for fracking, or can you retrofit an existing well in an existing field and just go after the layer of fracking?
Yeah, generally you drill a new well. What you do now is you'll take a vertical rig, you'll drill vertically, and you'll pull it because they're cheaper to drill that way. You take a more expensive rig to do the directional to turn it, and you'll put that down the hole. You don't want to go into an old well if you can help it. The casing may have collapsed, you put some junk, you put equipment down it, you don't know, so you start all over again.
Just go with a higher new standard.
Yeah, and the standards have changed a lot over the years. So this is what you're faced with. You get your money back pretty quick. It costs you about 70 cents an MCF to produce, just the cost of production. So, and there's taxes and stuff. You make about 3 times your money when you get through with this. These are more actual data from different places. This is the stuff in West Virginia and places like that in the blue. They have different initial starting points, but they all look the same generally. Again, this is real data, not theoretical data. So that's what all of the plays look like. The cumulative production by 7 years, you basically got it all. And then you're just making small amounts of gas. Oil, unfortunately, looks the same way. These are the tight wells. A conventional well, a traditional well, that doesn't look like this. It may decline 20% the first year. But these tight wells in the Bakken and North Dakota look just like it, have very similar economics. Wells cost more. An oil well here run $10 million. Okay. You hear a lot of talk about low cost. Well, maybe from a consumer's perspective, it's low cost. I did this for fun. This is Exxon, Chevron, Conoco, Oxy, the 4 largest oil companies in the United States. These 4 companies overwhelmingly produce conventional production, that is non-fracked production. These companies here overwhelmingly produce, they have no conventional production. They are basically frack companies. The average for the return on assets, which is the cleanest measure I have, is about 9% for the larger oil companies. It's identical with the industrial average for companies in general industry. Small companies are this. It's not a way to get rich unless you sell the company to Exxon. So these are not returns that are sustainable over long periods of time. And so you got a lot of growth, a lot of activity, a lot of well costs, but pretty low returns. Here I looked at their free cash flow last year. These small companies, a negative cash flow about $5 billion. That is the money they took in, less what they spent on capital. It's a very capital intensive business. $5 billion negative. Large companies, $21 billion positive. They paid out $25 billion in dividends. Remember who owns Exxon. It isn't Rex Tillerson. It's millions of pension funds. So business basically, while it generates more cash, these companies don't pay dividends typically. Business is basically a cash flow neutral business. People talk about the profitability in the business. They talk about it without understanding how huge the business is. Our cash from operations, that is the cash flow we have to spend, about $12 billion a year. Our capital program's a little over $10 billion a year. We grow 3, 4, 5% a year with that. The rest is paid out in dividends. That's generally what the industry looks like. That's why it has low price earnings multiples and other things, because extremely capital intensive. I looked at this number for like Microsoft, which is like 15%, just to give you a feel for it. So I think I'd rather be in a Microsoft business if I knew what that was. This is the water discussion. And we'll talk a little bit more about water. This is the state of Pennsylvania, which has a large new fracking business. These aren't typos on millions and billions. So this is public. Livestock uses in the state of Pennsylvania, which is not the state of Texas, 62 million gallons of water a day. The whole shale development is 1.9 million a day. The average golf course uses 4 million gallons in a season. So maybe we could close some of the golf courses in Latrobe. This is out of our Oxy's annual report. This number of jobs and some number of wells effectively. Some down here in California. Where does the water come from? Most of the water is recycled water or formation water. We give back in the San Joaquin Valley, we actually give back more water to the water district than we use because we clean the water up and return it to them. So it's not really a big water user. Most of the water is wastewater or formation water. And industry can do a better job of this, and we could return more water. You can see it here in the Williston. There's a lot of water, and that's pretty dry up there. Go back to this slide again. Again, protected from water contamination up here. The water, the frac fluid comes down here, sort of pushed out into the formations. What's in the mystery ingredients in this frac fluid that everybody talks about? Maybe you can't read my chart. It's mostly water, of course. It's 90% water. 9.5% of volume is sand, plain ordinary white sand. The other 0.5% depends. Salt, plain ordinary table salt, generally a little bit of hydrochloric acid. Remember, you put it down there so it reacts. Ethylene glycol, they use ethylene glycol, it's antifreeze. And so in North Dakota, it's cold, so they put a little ethylene glycol in it. This is really all there is, some citric acid. So it's about 0.5%. The aquifer is, all, of course, protected from it. This is pretty small stuff. All this is known and disclosed. There's no great secret here. The people try to hide the percentages they may have because they view it as proprietary. But generally speaking, this is really the whole list. And generally, you don't even have all of this. Finally, this is propaganda from the American Petroleum Institute, of which I'm chairman. And so, a part-time job. Anyway, this talks about the economic things. About 2 million jobs supported by the energy business. A lot of manufacturing jobs. Lowered the trade deficit. Generally a positive economic thing because of this fracking. It's really these formations. These are government statistics. Monterey, which is here, they expect to grow slightly. Light pink, some of this Bakken, they have this kind of growth. But that's really what's happened in the country. Almost all of this is driven by these unconventional reservoirs. I took this out of somebody else's stuff. And again, I'm not an expert at this. But I point out that I think natural gas can be more important for the United States going forward. And I think this is probably overstated for oil. I don't think the world can support us using 31% of our energy from oil. And this is the last one, I think. No, I got one more after this. If you want to raise the price of energy for whatever reason, who's paying for this? Energy and food, major component of food is energy costs, fertilizer and that sort of thing. It's not people making over $100,000 a year. It's people paying 11% of their income to make less than $30,000 a year in this country. Every time somebody monkeys with this, some guy from San Francisco, no offense to anyone, monkeys with this, or, what they're doing is hurting this blue collar class for some good that they might have. This clearly falls in the opinion class. Oil and gas industry, this is my last slide. The oil and gas industry mostly employs blue collar workers. 65-70% of our workforce are what's called blue collar workers. I always rued the day when somebody put out the Dallas TV program. I know the Hunts it was modeled under, and the old joke about Bunker Hunt was somebody came up to Mr. Hunt and said, "How'd you get to be a millionaire, Mr. Hunt?" He said, "Well, you start with $1 billion." This is hourly wages. This is from the government statistics. And these aren't ours, but ours are a little higher. So it's the last industry in America where somebody coming out of high school can go to work for us or Exxon or Shell or BP and send their kid to college. It's $75,000 a year, roughly. Most of our people make more than that, so probably around $90,000 a year. This is what the auto industry used to be like, but it's not anymore. It's one of the last industries where you can actually come out of high school, learn a skill, a trade, if you will, and get good paying jobs. The business has been growing the last decade. So I always wonder why people don't see that the people who are being hurt by this are basically blue collar workers. I don't think you need to worry about me or Rex Tillerson. That's all I got.
I'm going to get this microphone since we're streaming live, and if people have questions, they
Okay.
But Huron County looked pretty good. I think when you're done with Oxy, let's go back to our roots and we'll form the Bad Axe Gas Company.
If you've ever been there,
That's where I was born. Bad Axe.
he came from Bad Axe. That's a place.
What about the hot air company?
I have two questions for you. The first one has to do with natural gas. How come the idea of LNG never took off, and is it kind of a dead field?
Well, we used to think we were short natural gas in the country. And the last 10 years we've shown we're not.
Okay.
So we could clearly produce more. They were building terminals to import gas into the country. And there's a fair amount of money lost with that thought process. And those same terminals are trying to be flipped the other way. Generally speaking, the permitting process is very lengthy. There's only a few places where you really could build one in the United States, where they'll let you, along the Texas coast and the Louisiana coast. There's one in Maryland at Cove Point.
Yeah.
And there's one in Boston Harbor, but very, very few. I don't see. I'd like to put one under the Golden Gate Bridge, but I don't think that would be real popular.
So basically, we don't need to do that anymore. Or
We don't need to import it. We could export, but we don't need to import, and I don't think we ever will.
Then a question relative to fracking is that you hear all kinds of horror stories about pollution of aquifers. Now, where does that come from?
Yeah, I'll tell you where it comes from.
Okay.
There's been about 1 million wells fracked in the last 20 years. There's no evidence of that. Where it comes from is injection wells, let's waste disposal wells, for want of a better word. It's got nothing to do with fracking. So people, especially in Appalachia, drilled real shallow wells to dispose of waste product, either generally formation water. When the oil comes out of the ground, it's mostly water, and they float the oil out.
And it floats onto the ground and goes down.
Yeah, well, no, they inject the wastewater back into the formation, and sometimes they weren't careful about it. Most of the earthquake stuff, by the way, there's no fracking earthquakes, but there are injection well earthquakes, not in California necessarily, but in the middle of the country where people have, again, they re-inject the formation water into the formations, and when they push it out, you can get short tremors. But it's not caused by the fracking process, it's caused by the oil putting it back in the ground, to put it in the ground. Out here in Long Beach, at Thumbs, years ago, there was a subsidence issue. They were pulling the water and oil out, and the basin was subsiding. Yeah, and so now we re-inject the formation water to keep the subsidence down. Didn't stop. The state's got $750 million of your money sitting there waiting to reimburse you for the damages. But
How much?
It wouldn't get much in the railroad.
How much energy is put out in the fracking process?
I'm sorry.
How much energy is put out in the
Used?
fracking? Yeah, no, I mean, they talk about fracking, people make it sound like there's atomic bombs going on under there.
Oh, no, very little.
There's just a cracking.
It's a cracking.
A pressure.
It's a cracking. You can think of it as you put a hole in some cement, because that's really the porosity of the thing, and you're down at pressure, and you put water pressure essentially with the sand, and the sand acts to prop the holes up. So you push it out. So it's a fair amount of pressure, but it's water pressure.
That's not an explosion.
Oh no, that there was an idea years ago about using nuclear weapons to do that, but
That'd do something.
yeah.
Does that water come back up to the surface after you use it down at depth?
Yes, you bring it back up because it's too valuable to waste.
And then you have to clean it.
Then you clean it up. In Northern California, in Kern County, we clean it and return it as potable water to the water district. So if we stop fracking up there, they'd have a water shortage. So we return it. In Southern California, we return most of it as potable water. So we clean it to drinking standards.
Not all companies are equally good at making sure they clean it.
No, I think companies are pretty good. I mean, there's always a small producer, and you always have, you got individual acts of stupidity. You got a lot of workers. You do the same thing a lot. There's always going to be accidents. I went with a meeting with a bunch of guys from railroads not long ago. They haul. For the first time, really, in my lifetime, we haul a lot of oil by rail. Well, there's hundreds of thousands of miles of rail bed and track, and there's a certain accident rate they have. And no matter how much they work at it, they're going to have a certain number of accidents. Well, if they didn't haul on the oil, no oil ever got spilled. So now they're hauling more oil, so people wonder why there's these oil spills. It's because there's a certain number of accidents. And the same thing with anything. If you want absolute certainty, there can be nothing will go wrong. But I think water pollution is of the things I would worry about. Polluting the aquifer is the least. There are spills. Some guy comes up with a truck, he loads the truck up with oil, and he forgets to turn the knob to turn it off, and he drives off. That happens. Or he's driving down the highway in West Texas, and this guy weighs about 350 pounds, and he's drinking a beer, and he drives off the side of the road. Happens all the time. And you try to contain it, but accidents happen. It's not a perfectly safe thing. It's just the size of the incident is small. If you spill a truck of oil, it can be cleaned up fairly straightforwardly. If you blow off, on the other hand, if you go to an offshore well and you screw it up, you got a lot of oil coming in. It's just a matter of scale. So small things can be dealt with. Large ones really very hard. But it is a business of lots of people. It's fairly labor intensive, and like any other industrial business, there's going to be a certain number of accidents. We have about the same accident rate at Oxy as stockbrokers do, according to government statistics. So.
Yeah, that bad.
Do you believe that burning fossil fuels is causing climate change, and do you believe that companies like Oxy have a responsibility to address climate change?
I think I said in the beginning that I wasn't an atmospheric physicist, so I think that's my answer to that. I don't know. I was a geologist. I view the world as old, and I took my undergrad statistics in school. Two bad things for climate change. And so I was always trained that be careful about looking for patterns in random number tables. Is the climate changing? Yeah. What we can do is make sure that we don't waste any of the product. But as far as saying, well, you're not going to produce it anymore, I don't think that's our responsibility.
So something like 80% of all the energy used in the world today is fossil fuels.
Right.
And if you look out several decades, that percentage may go down, but it's not going to go to zero. And gas is a good transition strategy. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think for the United States especially.
Right.
More complicated in other places.
Right.
I mean, some places where there's no gas and no oil, and it's going to be imported. But as far as our responsibility not to produce it, I got 13,000 employees and 40,000 contractors and 40,000 stockholders. My responsibility is to them.
Bob?
One of your pie chart graphs showed electric generation and home heating, and you made the comment that fuel oils, did you say inefficient or ineffective or just a
It's
bad
an
idea?
inefficient way of doing that.
Why is that? It never occurred to me that gas and fuel oil, one's more efficient than the other. What is that?
Well, because of the transportation costs.
Anything to do with cleanup? You need more scrubbing or something?
Well, most oil products, fuel oil's got some sulfur in it, and so there's some cleanup. Not much like coal. And natural gas burns cleaner, more fully. So, but it's basically, from my perspective, a transportation issue.
Good segue. It's puzzling if we actually have enough natural gas to exist and continue in the future without importing anything. Why is it that certain entities seem so interested in bringing fracked oil down from Canada, passing through the United States? Where does Oxy stand on that?
Well, actually, it's not fracked oil. It's tar sands, which is not fracking at all. Tar sands are tar sands. Yeah. Frankly, Oxy would be well served for it not to be built. As a pure economic matter, this would be just wonderful if they didn't build it, because that's competition into our main markets. One of the major beneficiaries for not building it are the much hated Koch family, because the Kochs are refiners and they're not oil producers. And generally speaking, they're refineries in the middle of America, and they've gained by the lack of competition. So the Kochs gain by not building this. Who gains by it? You're bringing lower cost oil into the United States. I mean, that's the basic argument. Whether that's a good idea or a bad idea, I don't know. The safest way to move oil is not by train. The safest way to move oil is by pipeline. Pipelines have very low accident rates. Trains have high accident rates, and trucks worse. So if you're going to have oil, you need to move it by pipeline. If you don't like Canadian tar sands by bitumen production, if you don't think that they shouldn't do that, that really isn't the choice that an American makes. The Chinese will buy it if we don't. So the question simply is, do you want it brought here or not? As a purely economic matter, for us, they can keep it in Canada.
We're going to take one more, and then we're going to take a break.
Because it raises the oil price worldwide by them not producing. They've mixed it by that point. The refineries along the Gulf Coast are set up with Venezuelan crude originally, and so it probably pushes out Venezuelan crude.
We got one back here, last one.
First of all, the tar sands are the filthiest oil in the world. It's filthier than any other oil plant anywhere. It's extremely hard to refine based on just the very basis of the tar sands. But my understanding was it was never going to get sold to America. It was always going to get sold to China. We just had to put a pipeline through America so that China could get the oil, because Canada won't let us run the pipeline through Canada because it's too filthy.
No. If you're going to send oil to China, you don't send it to Houston. That's not the path to China.
Well, they have pipelines to the west.
They have pipelines to the west.
All right, Steve, thank you
Thank
very
you.
much. We're going to take a 10-minute break. And there are some reprints from last week's lecture. Steve's slides are up here. There's an article on water from this month's Fortune magazine that came out today. And I do think you ought to think about going home to Ubly, Bad Axe, you know. You talk to Pat, all right?
Yeah, I think I know what she'd say. Her mother is located there.
Steve's wife's mother is in a nursing home in Bad Axe.
Bad Axe.
That's where my mother ended up for the last part of her life. There's a wonderful book called Hollowing Out the Middle, and it's about what's happening in the population of the central part of the United States and how the population is going down. And it's a very interesting analysis, because when these little towns like I grew up in, you go off to college, even if you wanted to go home, there are no jobs there. And so you get the wrong kind of an education to go back to where you came from. Anyway, 10-minute break. I have a question for you, and if you get it right, you're going to win a prize. How much water does it take to produce a 1/2 pound cheeseburger? If you get it within 20%, you win. Half pounder with cheese. Half pounder with cheese. No. But it's 968 gallons of water. The 924 gallons for the hamburger, 24 gallons for the slice of cheese, 19 for the wheat bun, and the tomato and the lettuce take less than 2 gallons. But so every time you eat a hamburger, look how much water you're using. All right, our next speaker. Our next speaker is Ted Nordhaus. He's an American author, an environmental policy expert, and he's chairman of the board of the Breakthrough Institute. He was listed in Time magazine's Heroes of the Environment in 2008, the winner of the 2008 Green Book Award, co-editor of Love Your Monsters in 2011, and co-author of Breakthrough, the book that all of you got a copy of last week. And he and the speaker from last week, Michael Schellenberger, wrote what has become a very well-known essay, The Death of Environmentalism, in 2004. They have been described by Slate magazine as modernists or as eco-pragmatists. He co-founded the Breakthrough Institute with Michael Schellenberger in 2003, and now the Institute has a policy staff. They hold an annual conference. They have a policy journal, and they have a network of affiliated fellows. One of those is Peter Kariva, who will be speaking here, I think, in 2 weeks. They analyze energy, climate, and innovation policy, and their works have been cited by the President of the United States, National Public Radio, C-SPAN, the Wall Street Journal, and others. The Institute argues very persuasively that climate policy should be focused on higher levels of public funding for innovation, for technological innovation, to make clean energy cheap. And they've been critical of climate policies like cap and trade and carbon pricing that focus primarily on raising energy prices. They've conducted research showing that shale gas and other major technological innovations were created by American government institutions and public financing. They have, it's very interesting that some of you may know the name William Nordhaus, and that's the uncle of Ted. He's a professor of economics at Yale, and he wrote a very important book, The Climate Casino: Risk, Uncertainty, and Economics for a Warming World. And he's a very strong advocate for cap and trade. So they have to be very careful what they talk about over Thanksgiving dinner tables and Christmas. And in an interview with the Washington Monthly, Ted made the following statement, quote, "The truth is, living harmoniously with nature and having solar panels on your roof and shopping at your local farmer's market doesn't have much to do with actually helping soon-to-be 9 billion people live sustainably on Earth. If you want to save ancient forests around the world, you need more intensive agriculture, not less." Please join me in welcoming Ted Nordhaus.
Thanks, Jerry. So is this my clicker here? Okay.
That one forward, back, and that's the laser.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for having me here. So you'll get I guess you're getting a double dose of the Breakthrough Institute in this class, and we also are honoring Jesse Ossibel at our forthcoming conference with the Breakthrough Institute Annual Paradigm Shifting Award. So it's a lot of breakthrough. But thank you for your patience with it. So I'm going to talk today about energy, development, innovation, and climate change. I know that you heard from Michael last week, so there may be some overlap here, but we're told overlap is good. So, but I think I'm also going to have some new things to show you as well. You may have seen this slide, but really where I want to start is around the relationship between energy consumption and human well-being. And this slide really about says it all. So this is obviously on one axis we have life expectancy, and these are different nations around the world, and the other we have per capita energy use. And what we see here is a pretty strong correlation. The higher the per capita energy use, the longer people live. Here's just to kind of break it out a little bit more. So this is energy consumption in 3 countries, Nigeria, Bulgaria, and Germany. So a low per capita energy consumption nation in Nigeria, sort of mid-level in Bulgaria, and high in Germany. And now we'll show that next to life expectancy. And again, you see as energy consumption goes up, life expectancy goes up. And it's not completely linear in that a place like Bulgaria is an old Eastern Bloc economy with a lot of very inefficient energy production and consumption. But the basic pattern, as we saw from that first chart, pretty strong. And the correlation is pretty strong. And it's strong across all sorts of other metrics. So here you see infant mortality rates in relationship to energy consumption. Again, low energy consumption, high infant mortality rates, high energy consumption, low infant mortality rates. Pretty basic relationship there. And it's not just by the numbers. Energy consumption is just liberatory, has been liberatory for humans all over the world. As we consume more energy, we're able to live obviously more comfortable, but also more productive lives. So much of the world, even still today, women particularly, and spend much of their time and labor just doing really basic things, like gathering wood to heat and cook on, hauling water, washing clothing. So access to modern energy just liberates us, both from really sort of hard agrarian and subsistence labor, but it also frees up our labor to do the kinds of things that pretty much everyone in this room does, whether you run a think tank or an oil company or whatever else it is that you do with your career. It's probably not any of the things that these people are doing in these pictures. and part of the reason that our societies are as wealthy as they are, that we live such really historically remarkable lives, all of us in this room, is because energy consumption has allowed almost all of us to spend almost all of our time not doing the things that people in subsistence economies have done through most of history. And here's another just great example of that. We saw the woman starting just the amount that's necessary to wash clothing without modern appliances, the amount of time and labor, enormous. So just going from that, where you literally have to wring clothes out by hand, to the old wringers. I used to have one. I had an old family ranch in New Mexico. My family had where we still would go back to, and there was one of the old hand wringers, and that was just a great leap forward, again, especially for women. And then obviously modern appliances, vastly more labor saving. Again, no surprise, Bill Gates sort of famously observed, I think it was in a TED Talk or something, and it sort of seems to be cut off here, but basically, if you gave me only one wish for the next 50 years, I can pick who is president, I can pick a vaccine, or I can pick an energy technology, and I think it says something like at half the cost and with zero carbon, I'd pick the energy technology. The single most important thing you could do to improve the lot of humanity on the planet over the next 50 years. Not surprisingly, if you look globally and you look around the world, development is just an enormous priority just about everywhere. Between now and 2050, and we're going to kind of come back to these slides a couple of times, this particular slide. Global population expected to go from 7 billion to somewhere between 9 and 10 billion. Now, interestingly, and GDP expected to increase about 3 times, about triple between now and then. Part of that is just more people, and part of that is higher per capita incomes. One of the interesting things is, in all likelihood, the faster that GDP per capita rate rises, the slower the population growth will be. As people get wealthier, they have fewer children. So those are in an interesting relationship. And along with that, global energy use between now and 2050, IEA projects to increase somewhere in the neighborhood of 200%. If we really increase the efficiency of which we use energy, and interestingly, mostly what drives the increasing efficiency with which we use energy is not the light bulbs, but it's changing structures of economies. So our economy, manufacturing, is like 8%, and agriculture is 3%. If you go to a place like China, manufacturing, agriculture, much larger sectors of those economies, and those are much more energy-intensive sectors. So as economies diversify, as we become wealthier, as we move more to knowledge and information-based economies, few of us spend our careers, I would guess very few of the people in this room spent their careers working in a manufacturing plant or in agriculture, for instance. The energy intensity of economy, how much energy an economy consumes in relationship to its GDP, declines even without using more efficient light bulbs and all sorts of other more efficient technologies. But if we increase that rate of efficiency even more, you might get to 140%. We'll come back, as opposed to 200%. We'll come back to that, another element there, which is not just that it's more efficient, but also, this is actually energy use. When we get to emissions, we'll talk about fuel mix. But so efficiency might keep us at 140% as opposed to 200%. But what's really clear is that that is the amount of energy we're going to use over the next 4 decades is going to go up very substantially. And the reasons are because of all the slides I just showed you, because there's 9, 10 billion people on the planet. living in nations that are really, really clear that they need to develop, they need modern energy systems, and they need modern economies so that their populations can prosper. And so obviously that being driven primarily, we tend to think about global warming and talk about it a lot, problems like climate change, environmental problems as being driven by sort of people in the profligate West over-consuming. But most of that growth in GDP, energy use, is just going to come from people basically moving from subsistence economies to something that looks like modern lifestyles and living standards. And as that happens, you'll see a huge shift in the global economy. So this is the share developing, OECD, developing economies versus developed economies in 2010. And this, obviously they'll all be in one form or another of developed by 2100, but you see that ratio roughly reversing with places that we call the developing world now constituting 2/3 or more of the global economy by 2100. That's going to be happen with alongside another trend, which is urbanization. So this is projected urbanization between now and 2050. You see just the last few years, for the first time in history, the percentage of the human population globally living in cities versus rural areas. Actually, more people in cities than in rural areas for the first time ever, and that obviously is a trend that is going to kind of continue pretty radically for many decades to come. I want to talk a little bit in terms of energy access and development, particularly about Africa. Africa's at the center of a lot of particularly the energy access discussions. And when we think about Africa and we think about poverty in Africa and we think about development in Africa, what's sort of the first thing that kind of comes to mind? Well, besides that. What's the archetype? When you think of an African, who do you see? Yes, you see a very poor African living sort of some kind of subsistence, in subsistence poverty in a rural village. Interestingly, that's not actually really the main event in Africa anymore. And there's a lot of really interesting things happening in Africa. So obviously, Africa still has more people living in energy poverty than any other region in the world. And electrification rates, it's not uniform actually. Electrification rates range really widely between 7 and 72% between different sub-Saharan African countries. Really interestingly, Africa is growing economically really fast. Despite the corruption and all the stories we hear about what a basket case Africa is, Africa is actually developing. More than half of sub-Saharan African nations are growing at more than 5% a year, which is really fast. And 20 of the 22 sub-Saharan nations growing at over 3% a year. And Africans, just like every place else, are moving to cities, and they're moving to cities really fast. So these are projections of African population over the next 10 to 20 years. And we see, depending on the projection, some point between 2020 and 2030, many of these projections show, even in Africa, more people living in cities than in rural regions. So as much as we kind of go, things have stopped in Africa, development stopped, it's really not the case. Africa is developing. There's plenty of problems, plenty of crises, but in a bunch of different ways, Africa is getting its act together, and development in Africa looks a lot like development has looked in many other places in the world, and just starting with this trend. You leave the countryside, you move to the city, and you start living a modern life. And one of the interesting things, again, when we think about energy access and electrification, what comes to mind? Electrification. Pardon? Yeah. What's the kind of archetypal? You kind of think a country is electrifying. Cities. Okay. Well, I was going to say the opposite, but maybe it's just me. But I think a lot of times when we think about electrification, we think of rural electrification, we think of the TVA, we think about projects to bring electricity to, to the last places that don't have electricity. That is not how most people get access to modern energy and electricity. It's actually by moving to the city. Or by the place where they live actually becoming so densely populated that it actually becomes a city. So most people get access not because the power comes to them, but because they go to the power. Here you see a great picture of a I think this is a South African shanty. And in a lot of cases, at places in the developing world, it's not because the government comes and says, we will give you power. It's because people steal the power. They actually literally go and take the power down off the high power lines and bring it into their shanties. Rural electrification is really usually the last thing that happens. It's the last stage in energy access after everyone else has gotten electricity and most people have moved to the city and economies have gotten developed to the point that they're wealthy enough to very heavily subsidize the extension of the electrical grid into low density rural areas. That's when those areas finally get electricity. So the last places in the United States to get electricity were rural electric cooperatives, for instance, that many of you may know about all over the West. But most people by then had access to electricity. Again, this is how it's happening in Africa. This shows the percentage with electricity in urban areas versus rural areas. In Africa, you see in the much higher rates of electrification today already in African cities, and that trend only projected to continue. This is just looking at 2020 to 2010, and then looking forward. Again, with today still, I think only about a third of Africa's population in cities today, about twice as many new electrical connections, people getting access to electricity in African cities as in rural areas. Again, that's a trend that almost certainly will continue. And one thing that you don't see in that trend is one of the ways that's happening is not just static. There's people in the city without electricity. There's people in the rural areas without, and more people in the city get it. It's people moving from the rural areas where there is no electricity to the urban areas where there is. When we really look at how people get access to modern energy, and particularly electricity, first of all, overwhelmingly, it comes from the grid. So we'll talk a little bit about some other theories about how people in the developing world are going to get electricity. But certainly, historically, the way they've gotten it is by getting connected to a centralized electrical grid. Mostly, that is not happening just because sort of private sector companies and entrepreneurs are doing this. But in almost every nation in the world, it becomes very, very clear that electrification and access to energy is just a basic public good. And everyone should have it. And states, governments decide that this will be a priority, and they either build the electrical system themselves or they basically create heavily regulated private utilities with guaranteed rates of return, monopoly, providers of electricity to accelerate the extension of electrical and energy services to their populations. And they do that not just because they want everyone to have electricity in their homes, but because they see it as just a really, really key development prerogative, just remains critical to job creation, to building factories, industries, new sectors of your economy. Again, really, really hard to do that stuff as opposed to maybe power on a couple of lights and charge a cell phone without a centralized grid and centralized electrical generation. For that reason, coal is the fastest growing source of fuel in all of the big developing nations. So this is China. Look at the growth of coal in China. And we're very worried about the climate impacts of that. There's huge air pollution problems, but you just have to recognize that China has moved 500 million people out of pretty abject agrarian poverty to something that looks like modern living style standards by burning all that coal. Same with India, same story. Poorer, further to go, but India, and you hear lots of talk about India is going to go solar or whatever. India, just overwhelmingly coal that is providing energy to Indians and to India's economy. Now, Africa is very interesting, different story or different potential, which is Africa, it's possible, this is sort of one promising story you don't hear a lot, may actually largely skip over coal and go straight to gas because Africa has a lot of gas. And here you see the growth in African natural gas production since 1992. And here you see proven reserves. Africa actually has huge proven reserves all over the continent. And they're starting to develop those reserves. Now, the problem for Africa is that while we consume almost all of the oil and gas that we produce in the US and Europe, Africa exports most of its energy resources today. So you see net consumption versus production. Europe and the US consuming more than they produce, actually. Africa consuming substantially less gas than they produce. And the same is arguably even more the case with oil. So most of Africa's oil and gas going to Europe primarily, and also increasingly China, and not to Africans. You hear there's a big debate right now, for instance, about whether various US agencies should support natural gas, development of natural gas power plants and power systems in Africa. Or they should only support renewables. Well, just to be clear, that African gas is getting developed and consumed. It's just not being consumed by Africans. So basically, the official position of the US government over the last couple of years is that Africa shouldn't consume its own gas. But here's an interesting, as opposed to those charts you saw in China and India, Africa's energy future might look very different, and it might be a significantly lower carbon future than other parts of the developing world because they have so much gas. Now, I'm going to take you back to that chart just to kind of keep grounding us in the big picture. Global energy use, 9 to 10 billion people, GDP growing 3 times, energy use going to 200%, maybe 140%. And at the same time, IPCC and climate scientists saying that we need to reduce our emissions by about 80% from 1990 levels by 2050. Doing that would basically require bringing 1 to 2 gigawatts of zero carbon power online every day globally between now and 2050. It's an enormous, enormous task. That's about the equivalent of 1 gigawatt is about a standard nuclear power plant. So 1 to 2 nuclear power plants a day to stabilize emissions at 450 by 2050. So one question, obviously, even if Africa goes all gas and no coal, that's not going to get us there. So when we talk about these climate stabilization targets and what it would actually take to decarbonize the global economy such that it would have significant impact on climate change, you got to be talking about how you're going to power the world with basically very low or zero carbon energy. So how can we do that? Well, maybe we could just do with a little bit less. So let's start there. Anyone ever heard, there's a lot of talk, there's sort of this research that suggests that at a certain point, more money doesn't make people happier. Anyone familiar with that? So that's some research that was done back in the 70s and 80s, been widely cited, also widely challenged. I think it's pretty broadly recognized now that actually in a bunch of ways people do get happier after about $15,000 a year. But for the sake of this exercise, let's just assume that's right. After $15,000 every day, and you don't get any happier. So let's just imagine that we're going to have a world where incomes will be capped at $15,000 and wealth will be completely perfectly distributed. Everybody on Earth makes $15,000 a year. So let's look at, I think this is energy use. So let's go population. So about 7 billion people today, going to 8.3 billion in 2030, 9.1. This is sort of the midpoint projection by the UN population folks in 2050. So going from 6.9 to 9. Per capita GDP, again, we're just going to take it to $15,000 a year and just everybody gets their $15,000 check. Nobody gets any more, nobody any less. Again, we're going to just cap it there. Now let's look at where global GDP in trillions of dollars goes. So basically, global GDP, even under this completely unrealistic, never going to happen scenario, global economic output is going to more than double. So let's assume that we hold the carbon intensity of energy at basically exactly the same as it is today. Is that what we're doing? I'm not sure what that is. Anyway, I'll get this out and then I'll figure out what this slide is. I put this slide together so many years ago. Yes, so this is actually making fairly, we're not doing much with carbon intensity, but we're making pretty ambitious assumptions about energy intensity, meaning economies become almost 40% more efficient in how much energy it takes to produce $1 of economic output. Well, here you see global CO2 emissions under that scenario still by 2030 being substantially higher today, and the 22 billion tons is actually where we would need to be to hit the IPCC emissions targets. So again, with pretty ambitious energy intensity targets, or not even targets, but projections, perfect redistribution at $15,000 a year globally, you're still over 3 times higher than where you need to be in terms of emissions in 2050. Right now, the global energy access agenda imagines that we're going to go with that using less scenario. Basically assumes that poor people are mostly going to stay in their villages and not move to the city, that they're basically going to use solar panels to consume a very little amount of energy, about enough to power a light bulb for a couple of hours and maybe charge a cell phone. And in this view, really, energy just remains a household event. It doesn't really deal at all with the way that energy just drives societal development. And a big reason why these are the assumptions, if you go look at like the UN Development Goals, the Millennial Development Goals, any of the big international agencies, the reason they assume this is because they go, if anything other than this happens, as I just showed you, there's just no way we can hit our climate targets. Well, the truth is we're not going to hit them even if this happens. But this also keeps about 2 billion people living in just really dire poverty in 2050, 4 decades from now. So basically, sort of the official version of climate policy would have us basically not hit our targets, but keep huge numbers of people living in really, really serious poverty. And here you can see, this is the International Energy Agency's definition of energy access down there at the bottom. You see what actual energy consumption on average is. You see EIA projected in 2035. And then you see, if you go up to Germany or the US, you see what living in a modern economy, what energy consumption actually looks like. So Germany is, something like 15 times more than what the UN defines as energy access. And the US, obviously, even much more than that. So this today is basically the ambition of global sort of efforts to eliminate energy poverty, is really some solar panels and a couple of light bulbs. Just to keep moving, make sure we have time for questions. I want to take us back here. Again, back to this basic story. Energy going to go up 100, and demand going to rise 140 to 200%. You want to cut emissions 80%. How do you do that? Well, our argument for many years has been that the only way that happens is if you make clean energy really, really cheap and abundant. You're not going to regulate or price your way to a low carbon global economy. You just have to have substitutes for fossil energy that are cheaper, cleaner, and better. And until you have that, you're not going to make a lot of progress on reducing global emissions. So we talked a lot about shale gas earlier. And whatever you think about shale gas, it actually is a really interesting example. So here are US power sector emissions from 2000 to 2012. Since about 2005, US emissions have declined faster than any other nation in the world. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that we have just huge amounts of cheap gas. And I'm going to tell you the story in a minute about how we got all that gas. Because as David was illustrating, it is a very, very technologically complicated and impressive effort and technology. We kind of tend to think of that just you go stick a thing in the ground and some gas or oil comes up, but this is really high-tech stuff. But before I talk about that, I want to talk about some of the sort of myths, particularly in the environmental and climate sector that we have about where innovation actually comes from. Because clearly, if you're going to get that 1 to 2 gigawatts of low-carbon energy over a day, you need a lot of innovation such that you have energy technologies that really can replace fossil. So the first is what's called price-induced innovation. And this really, long-standing economic theory, which basically goes, if prices go up, people kind of come up with all sorts of new ways to do things. And there's some truth to that, but there's real limits to it. So most of the actual evidence for this in the energy sector really comes from the oil shocks of the 70s. So we saw big run-ups in oil prices because of the embargoes. And we've seen there's evidence, researchers found evidence that patenting activity went up. But it's an interesting story because, of course, it wasn't just the private sector doing all that innovative activity. As soon as oil prices went up, the public sector threw huge amounts of money at new energy technologies, both developing and commercializing them. So you really can't reduce the increase in patenting during this period to private sector response to prices. There's a bunch of other challenges in the energy sector. As David was noting, really capital-intensive technology. And as opposed to, say, something like software, where you can really sort of set up shop in your parents' spare bedroom and invent an app. Coming up with the technology to frack oil or gas or a new advanced nuclear technology or a new kind of solar panel is really an incredibly capital-intensive endeavor. Secondly, the end product is pretty undifferentiated, especially when it comes to electricity. One electron works just as good as another. Doesn't matter if it came from solar, wind, gas, coal. They all basically work the same, at least to the end user. So there's not really a killer app like an iPhone that people will pay a lot more money for because it is so much cooler or it does so many better things. And then you're not even operating in free markets. Most energy markets are heavily regulated. These are not markets that behave in the way that economists tend to think markets should behave. And they're not likely to behave in that way anytime soon. For that reason, energy has been one of the least innovative sectors of the economy, historically, at least when measured by the amount of money that is put back into R&D. So you see very highly innovative sectors like biomed, pharma, semiconductors, IT, national average. You see energy sort of way down at the bottom there, in part because it is really, really hard to innovate in the sector. Now, despite those problems, the longstanding argument has been, well, we've sort of seen some things when we get these price shocks, we get all of this innovative activity. So if we put a price on carbon, we'd get lots of innovation. But the reality is that there's very little evidence for that. So this is my uncle, the famous economist, who is sort of like the father of the carbon price. And even he, in his own research, finds that induced innovation, there's very little induced innovation from a carbon tax or cap and trade program. Big study by a London School of Economics economist recently concluded that private R&D expenditures are actually negatively correlated with market-based environmental policies. That where those policies were put in place, private innovative activity actually declined. We hear a lot about cap and trade and how much cheaper and how much innovation it spurred when we decided to use it to deal with acid rain. Actually, even there, the research finds that's not the case. Margaret Taylor, cap and trade programs do not inherently provide sustained incentives for private R&D investments in clean technologies. Dallas Bertroff from Resources for the Future, big Washington think tank that also big advocate of pricing and caps, also concludes induced innovation doesn't actually have much impact on reducing costs or driving technological change. And I'll skip over that. You get my point, that it doesn't work the way that the economists say it should work. There's a second problem, which is that we tend to think of innovation as this really linear process. So you get some science on one end, and you put it sort of at one end of the innovation pipe, and out the other end pops a technology. And economists have tended to think about this as there's not one market failure, what they call market failure, there's two. So the first is that we have externalized the social costs of carbon, and so there's sort of no market demand for low carbon technology. And the second is that basically for a bunch of theoretical reasons, firms aren't guaranteed to capture most of the benefits of their innovations, so they underinvest in innovation. And so they go, well, we've got these two market failures, so we'll solve them. One, we'll put some money into basic research, and the other will put a market, a carbon tax or some market mechanism to incentivize developing these technologies. But actually, decades of innovation scholarship find it doesn't work this way, that the innovation process is much, much more complicated with really multiple feedbacks all along the way between research, what's happening in laboratories, demonstration projects, commercialization, and all of those things feeding back to one another. And that there are lots of points at which innovation sort of doesn't stops, and technologies really falter between sort of someone who wants to buy your technology and someone with an idea or something that they've done in a laboratory that they think might work. Sometimes these are called valleys of death, but basically it takes a lot more to get a product to market than some sense that there's demand out there and some idea that there's a technology that might exist. So not surprisingly, pretty much every low and zero carbon technology that we've developed in the last 100 years. So here's fracking and gas, solar panels, wind, nuclear, hydro. Every one of them developed and commercialized with substantial state support, public support over many decades. And we do that in a bunch of ways. So here's George Miller, not George Mitchell, not George Miller, the father of fracking. And he has been justly celebrated as an entrepreneur who really just had the vision and the drive to actually figure out how to get gas out of shale formations. But there's a bunch of other people who got airbrushed out of that picture. These are the guys at the DOE. DOE's Eastern Shale Gas Project, who did the first demonstrations of many of the key fracking technologies. The guy up here is a guy named Norm Orpinski, the fellow, where's my thing here? So this is actually the guy who did all the microseismic, the geoseismic mapping of George Mitchell's shale project. He was loaned to Mitchell Energy by Sandia National Laboratories because they actually had the technology to do the mapping. And when you look at pretty much all of the critical technologies that came together to make the shale revolution happen, virtually all of them developed with substantial public support. That included massive hydraulic fracturing, which was really the first use of water to demonstration that you could put lots of water into these formations and get gas out. The drill bit technologies, directional and horizontal drilling, first demonstrated through federal programs, microseismic imaging and electromagnetic telemetry, developed initially by Sandia National Labs. There's a bunch of other technologies, but the story is really the same. And Mitchell knew it. Mitchell was one of the biggest advocates of these federal research and demonstration programs for shale. Another part of the gas revolution we don't talk about as much as how much more efficient gas plants have gotten. Really, it's a really interesting story in that this was a technology, the turbines were actually initially developed for aviation and developed over through decades of just military investment and procurement, really, and then commercialization in the aviation industry. And then they figured out that they could use these things to burn gas much more efficiently. So a big part of the reason that gas both is cheap and cleaner than other fossil sources of energy is because these turbines are so efficient. Obviously, most of you probably know the story of nuclear, developed by the Navy, commercialized by the Atomic Energy Agency. And that was Hyman Rickover, the admiral of the nuclear Navy. And even today, almost all of the key nuclear innovation, a lot of it is happening in China now. So this is a very sort of different nuclear technology, a gas-cooled reactor that the Chinese are demonstrating right now. Solar, developed first in Bell Labs under military contracts, then by NASA, and then obviously through major public subsidy and commercialization programs in the US, Japan, and then Germany. Same story with wind, initially developed by NASA. The big breakthroughs in wind turbine technologies really happened because of investments by the government in Denmark and programs to actually build a wind industry. Just because I want to make sure we have time, I'm going to skip here. I was going to give a little case study of where we go here on nuclear, but just want to close with one slide about ways in which energy is important not only to human development, but to the future of the environment. So we not only have a climate problem, but obviously lots of other resource demands, impacts on the natural world from growing human population and growing human wealth. And one way to solve those problems is not only to make energy so cheap that it can replace fossil energy, but that we can actually use it to substitute for other activities that are really create lots of environmental impacts. So for instance, ag innovation, not just GMOs, but fertilizer. Right now we use fossil fuels for fertilizer, but with enough clean, cheap electricity, we can make fertilizer without fossil fuels. And in the process, increase the productivity of ag lands. I think you guys talked about this some last week. Less ag land, more land for nature. Desalinization, another what will be an increasingly important environmental energy use. If you want to keep water in wild rivers, want to not deplete your aquifers, on this planet that we're heading towards, you're probably going to have to desalinate. And desalinization needs lots of energy, and we should do it with clean energy if we can. Well, I'll skip on the new species. We'll talk about that. Peter Kareva can talk about the new species. Anyway, I just want to really end with that story, which is that energy is not just about human development, but really it ultimately, if you look out throughout the 21st century, arguably cheap, clean, abundant energy holds the key not only for humanity's well-being, but for nature's. So thank you all.
Thank you, Ted. Okay, we have time for a few questions. Who has the first one?
So what does cheap, clean, abundant energy look like in a few realistic or optimistic scenarios? What could it look like?
I think really the two most promising technologies are nuclear and solar. Nuclear obviously has had its problems, but it also, we know we can run a society almost entirely, certainly an electrical system, almost entirely on nuclear energy. France has done it, Sweden does it, and that's with existing technologies, really no innovation. There's lots of potential for innovation there, and for those technologies to just both get cheaper and safer. And then solar, again, lots of potential for improvement, and solar really needs to improve because right now it's got a whole set of challenges that make it very difficult to scale at the level that you'd need to. But at least theoretically, sort of photovoltaic solar generation holds lots of promise. I also just want to not write off, we've got a lot of gas. It's increasingly, I think we're going to, I want to talk to David more. I think we're going to figure out in a lot of other places ultimately how to develop those gas resources. And gas in a bunch of contexts potentially has, in some ways is actually easier to capture carbon from than coal because it's cleaner burning to start with. So
solar, is that distributed or is that big plants?
I think if you're going to scale solar, it's ultimately going to have to be big plants. I think there's limits to how much you can do distributed.
Hi. We've talked a lot about nuclear and nuclear fission. Is nuclear fusion ever going to go anywhere?
Yeah, it's right around the corner, and always will be. You know, who knows? I think we're a long way away from it. I think we'll do advanced fission reactors and do that for a long time before we do a lot of fusion, but someday.
It's on. So do you see dotting the coasts with desal plants, and would they have to have adjacencies of nuclear energy to run them?
I think if you were going to do that at really large scale, yes, you would build nuclear and desal plants together.
And as everybody in this room knows, we're building a large desal plant, the Poseidon plant down at Carlsbad. And it's interesting because we've done programs on the opposition to desal. And it comes on in 3 areas. One, that you're taking water from the ocean, so there's an entrapment of plankton, fish eggs, and larvae. Number 2, you discharge high salinity water, the byproduct. It's about twice average ocean salinity. And number 3, they take a lot of energy. But when you look at all 3 of those with the best science, the Japanese, more than 15, 20 years ago, solved the intake problem by burying it under a layer of sand. Any engineer worth anything can design a diffuser so that you would never see an increase in salinity over a very small mixing zone. And the calculations on energy are that with the best current designs, Carlsbad won't take any more energy than pumping water from Northern California to Southern California.
Yeah, is that a rational comparison?
Well, but if you're going to object, object on other grounds.
Better than a coal mine.
Yeah.
Why aren't you talking about energy or water conservation? Is it because there's no money to be made off those?
Well, no, if you listen to the energy efficiency people, they'll say we're all leaving $20 bills on the floor every day, and there's some truth to that. But it's just that there's, well, there's a couple of reasons. One is that it's just very hard to move the needle with technical energy efficiency at societal levels. You know, you can get your bill down in your home. But when you look at all of the embedded energy, where that's going, how it's being produced, you look at the feedback effects. If it's truly cost effective, you get rebound effects. Basically, what energy efficiency is just another word for an energy productivity improvement, which means that the functional cost of energy is less. And any economist will tell you, it costs less, people are going to use more of it. Now, you're not going to heat your home to 90 degrees, but particularly if you're in China and you don't have any heat, or you have very little money to heat it, when you make heating less expensive, people are going to heat their homes more. When you make driving less expensive, they're going to drive more because demand is not saturated. So, like I said, those numbers I showed you had a lot of energy efficiency in them. And our economies have been getting more efficient for hundreds of years. And we've been using more energy, both because we find new ways to use them, and because part of that energy efficiency is really tied up with economic growth. And economic growth has just outpaced efficiency, and efficiency feeds back and actually contributes to economic growth. So for all of those reasons, efficiency may result in demand not growing as fast as it might otherwise, but you're not going to get significant reductions in energy demand from efficiency. And you really can't find any place in the world where that's happened.
I think there are still lots of opportunities on water conservation, certainly here
No, water's
in this
different.
state.
Water is really different
Yeah.
because it's energy is sort of a master resource. It's so fungible. You can use it for so many things, and you can substitute for other things. So energy gets cheaper. People substitute it for labor. They substitute for other resource inputs. That's why, we don't have to wring our clothes anymore, because we've got enough energy is so cheap that you can run a washing machine and a dryer with it. And energy efficiency makes energy cheaper, and at least in many places, in many contexts, that results in us finding new ways to use it.
If you want to, tomorrow night there's going to be a very interesting lecture by David Sands from Montana State University. He's a bacteriologist who's done everything from developing bacteria to put in clouds to make it rain. But he has a new product. He's trying to get people to move from eating so much rice to this wild oat product. It takes much less water to grow. It has lower carbohydrate content, higher nutritive value, and it's a very interesting story, and I hope some of you will come. And you might even get a chance to taste what some of this product tastes like. All right, who has, we've got a, yes, sorry.
Did you have a slide up there that said that there was limited research and development for energy, and one of the reasons was because the output is the same regardless of the source? Did I read that slide right? You had
basically, yeah. Well, what I said is that the product is pretty undifferentiated.
Right, but that just seems to, what about when you look at the whole picture and all the external costs associated with each energy source? Do you understand what I'm asking?
Yes, if you put a price on carbon and it was high enough, you might get really different energy choices, people making different energy choices. But then you have to go back to the fact that, you know, about a third of the global population can't afford hardly any energy at all. So this is not a strategy for dealing with where most of the growth in energy demand is going to come from over the next 50 or 100 years. It's going to come from really, really poor people. And, you know, your externality is their, their modernity. And the social cost of carbon looks really, really different if you're sitting in this classroom versus if you're sitting in Somalia. The existential fear that we all have of climate change, in like that, the ice shelves are collapsing and temperatures are going to go and agriculture is going to collapse. That existential fear is that we're all, or our children or our grandchildren, are going to end up living like Somalis live today, in this sort of Mad Max kind of sort of subsistence survival world. So if you're a Somali, or for that matter, someone in China or India, your desire to factor in the social costs to you of their getting access to modern energy doesn't look like such a good idea.
Steve, within the oil and gas industry, do all the large companies make a significant investment in R&D?
Yeah, but we don't list it normally in the annual report that way.
Right.
It's just not reported the same way.
This is an important.
Our budget, if you were to break it out that way, something like 10 to 15% of our capital spending would be classified as R&D. So $1 billion and a half. Probably at Exxon, I'm guessing it's the same percentage. Their capital program was about $30 billion. So it's probably about $5 billion.
I think on the production side, it's probably higher.
Yeah.
You know, those numbers include like the utility sector.
In the utility sector, there's no, because the government won't let them pass the costs through.
The difference in reporting, is that to keep the shareholders happy?
No, not really. It's just too much trouble to break out. It's sort of a pointless. It's an SEC requirement that you list R&D, and that's really the only reason people list it at all. The question is, what is it? Is it inventing cures for cancer? That's one thing. Or a new electronic technology, or is it figuring out that actually the guy that worked for George Mitchell, his stuff with the seismic wasn't worth a shit, and didn't work, didn't do anything, didn't help George. It led him down the path because George, being a geologist like me, was a deterministic person, and he was dealing with a statistical problem. And he tried.
I'll let you debate that with Dan Stewart one of these days, but.
Okay, we had one up here.
Oh, yes, thank you. Sorry, I'm just trying to wrap all this around in my head because this is just like how Jerry started the whole class a few classes ago. This is very new information for me as an environmentally minded individual. So I'm trying to understand this story. So have a little bit of patience with me as I try to actually understand my question. So if you're saying to get to a green planet that addresses our environmental concerns for a 9 billion people planet, and actually in the answer to your last question, you addressed it, is the existential fear of environmental collapse is how Somalis are living right now. That's the gamble. That's what we're working with. So to get to that green planet...
It's a gamble for you. It's not a gamble for the Somali.
But not necessarily for me, but for the entire planet already. So to get to a clean, green planet, we need to get more nuclear and solar. And then to get there, we need a transition fuel of shale, of fracking oil, fracking gas, to get to that point. And what Mr. Schellenberger talked about last week was he said those are to get there, we have to just be mindful and be aware of and be conscious and active about what he called the environmental trade-offs that get to that point. But isn't there a fear that as we go toward that, as there's more capacity, more consumption, more of this use, those environmental trade-offs become so large that they reach that tipping point, much like the Deepwater Horizon was a much larger spill than the Exxon Valdez, and much like the Fukushima reactor break was just so massive. These trade-offs get so large, correct?
Well, I think you would say those trade-offs were, none of the examples you gave were very large, really. I mean, Fukushima, any increase in cancer will be undetectable, even among the populations that live right near the accident. You know, the Gulf, we're sort of looking really hard to find long-term impacts from the Macondo accident. And we'll find some, but it's not like the Gulf is not going to die from that. So, you know, there are trade-offs, and I think what Michael was saying is that there are environmental trade-offs associated with all of our energy technologies and almost everything in life, including the ones that we think of are as environmental. You know, wind, solar, huge land use impacts given their current form of those technologies, as well as a lot of just basic toxic, you know, producing solar panels, incredibly toxic. And if you ever scaled it, it would be really, really toxic, at least, again, the way we make them now. Grass-fed beef, we were talking about at lunch. You know, I love it. Tastes great. You know, it's a privilege to be able to eat that kind of luxury product, but it's incredibly land intensive. This is not a solution for 300 million Americans, much less 9 billion people on the planet. So there are trade-offs. You know, there may be some tipping points out there, although the science on that is actually pretty weak. You know, there are unknown unknowns, but in terms of, and maybe there's some known unknowns out there, but in terms of the kind of, like, we know that there's a tipping point at X, there's really just not much evidence for that. There's linear, you know, most of the impacts, whether it's climate or other things, are basically linear, particularly at global scales. So things will get worse. The more impact we have, the less nature there is, the more pollution there is, the more health effects there are. But the idea of these sort of dramatic discontinuities, maybe they're out there, but we actually don't have a lot of good evidence for them at this point.
I think the evidence is fairly clear. Nature is pretty resilient, and it deals with events, whether they're large events like atomic testing in Bikini Atoll or the Deepwater Horizon blowout. It deals with those much better than chronic problems. A far bigger problem in the Gulf is the discharge of nutrient-rich water from the Mississippi. And you can look around the globe, and those are the things that we need to tackle. I think I'm going to let you ask yours after we adjourn. We're coming to the end. I think for me this has been a really very good 4 weeks. We never promised any answers. What we promised was that we hoped that we would stimulate questions and that you would ask yourself how you really felt, or whether the positions that each of us has need to be re-examined. And because this guy to my right, he was an active environmentalist most of his life, leading campaigns, and stepped back. Those of us who've spent our careers as environmentalists, we're losing. It's not working. We need to reframe the issues and look at different approaches, and some of those approaches challenge everything we believed in. I grew up with Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, and this idea that nature is fragile and that it's a tapestry and it can come unraveled, or it's the equivalent of a plane, and if you remove so many rivets, the plane is going to collapse on the runway or in flight. That's not what science, the best ecologists tell us. So I hope that we've aggravated you. I know that we've aggravated some of you. That's a good thing. Go home and think. Come tomorrow night, and then when Peter Kariva, the chief scientist for the Nature Conservancy, talks in a couple of weeks, member of the National Academy, one of the world's greatest ecologists, and there was a move to try to get him fired from his position within the Nature Conservancy because he's challenging a lot of these thoughts. And he cares an awful lot about the environment, and he's worth hearing. And so was Ted, and so was Steve in the back, and we thank all of you for coming, and we hope we'll see you again.
Thanks.